I have this thing I want to read at the beginning from John Shelby Spong. John, some of you all big fans of his, some of you not necessarily big fans of his. Controversial writer, Episcopal priest, pretty much challenging the way we think about tradition and thinking we need to come up with new ways of thinking about our relationship with the holy, with God, with what's divine in our midst, with the sacred all around us. He wrote this about prayer. When St. Paul said that we are to pray without ceasing, he surely did not mean we ought to say prayers without ceasing. When people envision the kingdom of heaven as a place where people are praying all the time, I'd just as soon not go if that's the reality that you have to deal with. I remember being at the Bible church in Northwest Bible. I shouldn't have said the name. I'm sorry. Anyway, I remember being at a Bible church somewhere over in another city, and as a kid, and I remember how he had said, that when we go to heaven, there's going to be this heavenly golden gated place, and we're all going to be sitting around singing choir songs and hymns, singing the great hymns of the faith. And I remember thinking, even then as a kid, 14 years old, thinking, God, our choir sounds terrible. I just can't imagine what that's going to feel like. And then thinking about his prayers and how tedious sometimes those prayers could be, this idea of praying without ceasing seems a bit ancient, seems a bit obsolete maybe. And yet, this is what I'm going to say right up front. I want you to hang on to it, because we're in this series, in this sort of cultivating a balanced spiritual life, and of all the things, we got cultivating curiosity or learning, and we got cultivating prayer or being aware, we got cultivating service and generosity and gratitude and play. All of these things, I'm going to suggest that this one is the most important. And that in fact, we ought to be praying without ceasing. So just hang on to that, because I don't want you to go too far ahead of me. Because the first thing I think we have to deal with is that I think a lot of folks have a problem with prayer. Maybe not in here, maybe in here. Certainly I still do at times in my life. The reality is that we struggle with life that throws curveballs. We struggle with the blues every now and then. And granted, I'm a middle-class, upper middle-aged, white kid, fingerstyle guitarist. Anybody who sings the blues, even as nice as Mike is, would say, boy, you ain't got the blues. But the truth is we do experience the blues from time to time. We do experience this life is up, life is down. And where does prayer fit in the midst of it? When I was 14, I saw my father for the first time in about 4 or 5 years. He'd moved from Fort Worth to Houston, from Houston to British Honduras. It was 1971. British Honduras eventually became Belize. Some of you probably traveled to Belize. My father was one of the first folks from the United States to ever be there, had a tiny little place called Paradise House. Bad conflicts in my family, a lot of dysfunction, a lot of struggle, a lot of alcoholism, a lot of problems. Hadn't seen him in 4 years, went down to see him by myself at 14. Very difficult moments together from time to time throughout the weeks that I was there. And I remember he would often say to me, because I had become a Christian a few years before that, I had an experience and was going to the Bible church, and he said, you talk about paradise. We're here. And he showed me he'd show me the name over his hang on a second, I just canceled my sermon. He showed me the name over his hotel, which said Paradise House. And he was like, this is paradise, right? Look at the reef, the second largest barrier reef in the world out there outside of Belize, just half a mile out. And then this beautiful 10 to 12 foot water in between, and this gorgeous reef that went the length of the coastline up and down for miles. He says, where else could you imagine there being paradise? You are here, my friend. But it discounted me, of course. It just discounted who I was and what I understood. And there was all this anger and emotion, and I found myself one mid-morning so upset. I saw next to the little dock was one of those plastic sort of life rafts. And I grabbed a 15-foot pole. It had a little anchor in it, and I just started poling my way out the way that the old fishermen would do when they took their hollowed out logs and tree trunks and would pole their way to the fish traps, the lobster traps and such. And I just poled my way out there slowly, making my way out towards the reef, not really going anywhere, just getting away. And as I poled my way further out there, concentrating on what I was pushing, I noticed the pole was going down further, until after a moment I noticed the pole wasn't touching anything at all. And I looked back, and I was almost a mile away from the shore. I had drifted out through the cut in the reef, and the current was carrying me out to the ocean. And there were no boats. And I was in a tiny little 6-foot plastic raft being carried out. And I said, God, I promise I will never do what I did before. I made all sorts of promises to God. I prayed that God would turn the current around, carry me back in, and then I heard a voice in my head say, don't forget you got an anchor. And I threw the anchor out. It's a 35-foot anchor rope. And it was swinging down underneath the water as the boat continued to go out. And I truly, for one of the first times in my life, had a sense of absolute abandonment and panic. What do we do when we get in those places, right? We pray. Tell the truth, most people are foxhole prayers. We cry out in the midst of the pain, why have you forsaken me? Why have you forgotten me? Where have you gone? Come on, God, I'm really good. I do things. I work well. I'm a kind person, generally, for the most part. I give to, why is this happening to me? We become foxhole prayers, and we just pray, this time, if you just get me out of this one, if you just help me past this one. It's a sense of being sort of victimized by life, the blues. But if it's we have a precedent for it, right? I mean, go ahead and give me a note here. The whole Old Testament is basically the blues. Been 40 long years, Lord. 40 long years, ain't got no place to call my home. Oh, said it's been 40 long years, Lord. Lord, I got blisters on my toes and left in the desert to roam. Well, I should have stayed back with old Pharaoh. 3 square meals a day, at least it's some kind of home. That's all I got for that one, so. I just said, strike it up if I call you. So here's the thing. The whole Old Testament is really all about the blues. I mean, it's always this struggle of getting it right and getting it wrong and then getting it right and then getting it wrong. And this Deuteronomic understanding of who God was, this ancient sort of understanding that if we're just good enough, we won't have problems. If we're just obedient enough, we won't have problems. But the reality is we get the blues. It comes anyway. It comes to good and bad alike, like the Bob Dylan song, it's not because we've got God on our side, because if we did, God would be on all sides. In fact, in many, many ways, God is present in the midst of all of this mess we're in. So the challenge is then, if it's not about me connecting to God, then what is it about me connecting to God? In other words, if it's not about God fixing my life, fixing things the way I think it should be fixed, then where does prayer come in? What's the point of the prayer? You remember that movie, Bruce Almighty? How many of y'all saw Bruce Almighty? How many of you seen it like 15 times? I watched it because I had kids when we first started watching. The kids were at home, and then I still watch it all the time. And I love this character, Bruce, right? Jim Carrey, I love this character because he's going to fix things. He figured out he could do a better job. God gives him the power. In the first couple of days, he's already overwhelmed by trying to answer these prayers. And so he comes up with a clever idea. He's going to have a software that will just answer yes to everything, right? Seriously, think about it. Yes to everything. Every one of us praying our prayer of individual need. Every one of us praying to God, who surely must be listening to each one of us. Each one of us just as righteous, just as worthy of God's response. Every one of us get our prayers answered. And it's total chaos. right? The whole thing just becomes chaotic. The whole city starts to fall apart, and pretty quickly we realize that a lot of what people pray for is not only not healthy or reasonable, but sometimes it's actually illegal as well. People get prayer all wrong. 1985, Hurricane Gloria came through on the East Coast. One of my favorite televangelists, Pat Robertson, was having a prayer. Said he was praying to God. God was going to pass by Virginia because that's where his organization was. Had other people praying. The hurricane hit towards the coast, turned right, went up the coast. Missed his complex, missed his whole organization. And the next day, he was giving God glory and praise and saying it was because of the faithful prayers of everyone involved, and he was thanking them. And don't forget to keep sending in your money because obviously God supports this ministry. Meanwhile, Long Island was devastated. Lost lives and property with God on our side. There's this understanding that's natural for us because we're human. Because we like what we have, or because we like to be safe, or because it's easy to be afraid. When we operate out of our spirituality, out of this idea of fear, prayer becomes something entirely wrong. In fact, what some people might even say is really pretty much an addictive pattern. It's pretty much like any other addiction. And we lean on it, thinking it's going to answer. Can we throw up the 65, 70%. If you ever studied the Enneagram has 65% of folks are number of 6s and 5s, and they're basically people who sort of live in a constant state of wanting everything kind of under control, like meerkats, always kind of on the lookout, always waiting for the next thing to go bad, always waiting to make sure that you got control of things. You don't stare at it too long, it's going to freak you out after a while. It's going to get weird. There's just two heads going back and forth. Don't look at it too long. Richard Rohr and Parker Palmer speak of this spirituality that he suggests that there's two stages of this spirituality. There's the first half, the second half. A lot of us get stuck in the first half. Typically, where Piaget, the educational cognitive psychologist, would say that we're sort of in that concrete stages. But in fact, in our faith, we get stuck in that concrete stage. We don't really have a lot of practice of what it means to be open to awareness, what it means to be aware of the greater reality around us. And so we get stuck in this kind of concrete stage because nothing challenges us. In other words, life is good, life is great until it's bad. And then we turn to God. When in fact we need to be in practice of being present to what's holy in our midst all the time. We need to be in touch with what's possible all the time. And he calls that the second stage of spirituality, the second half of the spiritual life, when life opens up. Most of us orient towards life as a way of as a way of being broken or fixed, broken or fixed, broken or fixed. And until we get out of that mindset, until we get out of what is really an addictive mindset, really a materialistic mindset, in fact, that life is more journey, and even more importantly, it is community. We have to open up to one another. We have to be present with our enemies. We have to be present with folks that make us uncomfortable. We have to be present to moments that are challenging. That until we open up and realize life is journey and God is in the midst of that journey, that we are in the midst of the ground of being, and the ground of being is in the midst of each one of us. Until we get there, we're back to restitution. And I can tell you, I'm going to pray for that same thing. When I get on a flight and I go overseas, I'm going to say, God, please hold this airplane up. Please keep it across the ocean. I'm going to go there because I get scared. Everybody gets scared. I know better. And so I'll practice, and I'll try to remember that I live in the midst of sacredness all the time, that I live in the midst of the holy all the time. There's a lot of ways to practice that. I'm going to give you a couple of ideas. One is to begin thinking like what Sharm was saying, just practicing this ability to just be present. Pico Iyer, great writer and travel writer and thinker, philosopher, he had this wonderful TED talk about stillness. And where he talks about the stillness is, he used to say that traveling around the world was amazing because you see so many things, until he realized one of the most amazing experiences is being still. Think of how many times in your week you intentionally are still. How can you experience the sacred when we're not still? How can we experience the wonder when we're rushing past to the next destination, to the next task that we have to get done, when we're worried about what's happening to us? How can we be still? He says sometimes the best thing you can do is just do it and just stay there. In the boat, as I was floating out past that reef and that further and further away till literally I was down towards the end of the island, I finally caught my breath. It's not the first time I faced fear, and I remembered that. And I caught my breath for a moment and looked down at the ocean and noticed something. The current goes out and the current goes in. And so I took the pole, and with every time the current went in, I just gave it a good thrust. And then as it went out, I just didn't do anything. And then when it went in, I gave it a thrust again. And I continued to do that back and forth until after about an hour, I actually made the shore at the very end of the island. And as a reminder to what it means to be present and maybe what it means not to always run from things, I got to drag that boat all the way back down to the other end of the island. But this idea of being present. I want to end with one little last short story, and I'll let the band come on up. This camp that I got to work with, called Camp Rainbow. It's this great camp out in Prescott, Arizona, up in the top of the mountains out in Prescott, Arizona, beautiful up there. We would go every August, and it's kids with cancer. And one week we decided to go to the top of this mountain because there was a tennis court up there. 2 a.m, one of the counselors said, you got to come up here and see. Second week of August, we got up there, we laid down on our back, and the Perseid meteor shower began. And ever since then, every year, we would bring a couple of extra counselors, maybe a couple of kids, because we're breaking the law. We're not supposed to be sneaking out in the middle of the night from our cabins, but we would do it anyway. And one week, we brought Kat, who was this teenager who had just come that week, first time. She had a bad prognosis with cancer, a brain tumor, but she was in treatment, and they even brought the treatment to the camp so that she could be there. So we were very concerned about Kat. We were very upset and worried and awkward. And we sat out there and waited for the stars to start shooting across the sky as we laid there, and Kat's just laying there silently as we're watching. And then one comes across the sky and we just go, yeah, that's amazing. That was incredible. And then nothing. And Kat looks over and says, is this it? Is this all there is? And that statement hit Woody and myself. Woody and I are both ministers, and Woody was the music director there with me, and it hit both of us really in the gut. The double meaning of that question. And we didn't know what to say next because we were sure it was going to happen. Maybe we were just 30, 40 minutes early. It's going to happen. And that's when one of the other guys broke the silence and just let out this big loud belch. He just burped. And it kind of took us by surprise, and we all giggled and we all laughed. And then to our surprise, Kat let out one. She let out one. She's a little demure girl, and she just let out this big belch. And we were just laughing, and then one other one said, yeah, watch this. And he belched out the alphabet. And before you know it, we were just belching back and forth, and then boom, a flash of light, and then another flash of light. And it went on for like 45 minutes, about 20, 30 flashes every minute. It was amazing. We just sat there in awe. And afterwards, it was probably 3 or 4 in the morning, and Woody's going like, this is the worst idea ever. I'm going to be so beat up all day. Got a whole day of camp ahead. And we're making our way back down to the campground. And as Kat walked away, I looked at Woody, and I said, Woody, we're both ministers. It's a shame we don't get to pray with these kids a lot more. They want this to be non-sectarian and stuff. And Woody looked at me, and he said, Tom, this thing, it's all the blues. And prayer is nothing but the blues wide awake. Last week when I went to my wife and I said, can I help you with cooking? Because she sends me out of the kitchen every day. Whenever she's cooking, she's like, get out. I said, I really want to do something. I was kind of frustrated. So I said, can I at least help prepare things? She said, sure. Go out and get some spices from the garden. And I said, well, what do I get? And she said, I'll tell you what. Probably one of the best things she said to me in a long time. She said, go smell them and pull the ones that excite you.